It's not something we're used to doing with our computer. So I think this is kind of new.
The whole rhetoric around the power of AI is about how it's changing the way that we work.
Once you type your data in and you press that enter key, you're setting your data free and, you've kind of lost control of that.
Hello world, welcome to the Tech Overflow podcast. I'm Hannah Clayton-Langton.
And I'm Hugh Williams, and we are the podcast that explains technology to curious people. How are you, Hannah? How's life?
Life's great. I'm excited to revisit our favorite topic of AI today. How are you?
Oh, I'm well. I've been doing lots of prep for this episode, including exploring my own use of ChatGPT and Claude and all kinds of things, reading some research papers. It's been a ton of fun, but really pumped to get into this episode. And as you say, great to be back on AI. I mean, we did those 2 fabulous episodes in season 1. If you want to check those out, they're episodes 6 and 7. And then one of our best rating episodes was episode 2 in this season, where we talked about vibe coding and agentic AI. So it's just great to be back on the theme, Hannah.
Yeah, love the theme. I find that the AI topics are the ones where I feel like my brain chemistry changes the most because I learn so much. Today, I'm very curious for us to get into how people are actually using AI. And I guess when I say AI in this context, I really mean LLMs, like I think a lot of people do. So how are you using it? How should I be using it? I think we've got some external sort of stats on how other people are using it. And should we be worried about the ways that we are using it?
And as your resident expert, Hannah, I'm really keen to unpack what happens when you type data into one of these LLMs. Where does your data go? How is your data used? Where is your data stored? How long is it stored for? And maybe give our listeners a little bit of advice and counsel around sort of how to think about that data. So I think this will be a fun episode.
100%. And our first episode of this season gave me pause for thought around my data in general. And I got feedback from some other friends that listened that they felt the same way. So we're about to make that existential crisis a whole lot worse, guys. Talk about LLMs. Well, when it comes to how I'm using AI, I did prepare something earlier, which may be a good place to kick us off. So I actually asked ChatGPT how I use ChatGPT. I asked for it to summarize it. I don't know if that's allowed, but here we are. And it gave me my top 3 use cases. So I will walk you through them if you're interested.
Oh, I'm very interested.
Okay, so first one, everyday decision support. That's quite vague and not a huge surprise. Makes practical decisions faster. Outsourcing research. Actually, I just bought some new running shoes, so ChatGPT helped me choose them. Second related theme is health and performance curiosity, exercise physiology, bit of cold water swimming. If you've listened to earlier episodes, you know that I was curious about cold water swimming.
In London? Seriously?
Hugh, in London, in March, I went for at least 60 seconds in 9-degree water. Whoa. It was really cold.
That's ice bath territory. Anyway, okay, go Hannah. Yeah.
The third one, which is probably the most flattering, is intellectual exploration. So it says here economic or career topics, language and etymology, and AI concepts. No surprise there. So top 3, I think that's a fairly accurate representation of myself from my trusty in-pocket decision helper, aka ChatGPT.
That's a great set. You should be very, very proud of that third bucket, language and etymology. Look at you go. That's awesome.
I did study languages at university, so I didn't realize that I was actually still thinking in that way, but I must be. Yeah.
I didn't do the same homework, but I'll tell you what I did do, Hannah, and maybe our listeners can follow along with this. If you've got ChatGPT installed on any device, you can actually go into the settings, and if you scroll down, you'll see an option called personalization. If you click on that and then you scroll down again, you are going to see an option called memory. If you click on that, and then you click again on manage memories, you'll see a bunch of memories that ChatGPT has summarized from all of the sessions that you've had with ChatGPT. So these are things that it thinks about you. And I scanned these and I came up with my top 3 categories. Bit of overlap, I think, Hannah.
Okay, and just to be clear, these aren't prompts that it's saved. These are like snippets of information it's gleaned about you as a person.
Yeah, correct. So these are sort of meta level summaries. So it's a little bit like the prompt that you ran, Hannah, to find out the top 3 categories. If you like, these are sort of meta reflections on the kinds of things that I ask. Maybe later on in the show, we can talk about how these are used behind the scenes in ChatGPT, but maybe not so important for now. But it looks like if I bump up a level and try and pick the top 3, I would say I spend a lot of time talking to it about music and musicians.
Very cool.
And a lot of time talking about recipes, nutrition. So, for example, It's figured out that I don't like eggs and I like a breakfast smoothie with increased yogurt and hemp protein. So
Sounds very
that's
healthy.
true. So lots of optimization, things about cafe lattes, all kinds of very Melbourne things. And then a good amount of, fitness, running related stuff, including lots of memories about park run, because I love a park run on a Saturday and how many park runs I've done and where I've done them and suggestions for park runs and all those kinds of things.
That sounds pretty accurate, to be honest. So you're using it for everyday queries, it sounds like.
Yeah. And it's got quite a few memories in here that I should probably delete. So it says that I'm going to London for 3 months at the end of June. I think that was 2 years ago, so I could probably safely delete that. But there's a few things in here that are off base, as it were.
Okay, so you can delete the memories, and they sort of form there and sit there and reinforce the output. So like when we were coming to Melbourne, I asked for travel tips, and it was like, oh, do you want me to recommend some hikes? And that's probably because it's worked out that I like hiking.
Yeah, absolutely. And likely what's happening behind the scene here is that when you type in a prompt into ChatGPT, behind the scenes, it's secretly appending these memories, and then these memories are used in the context window in the LLM to produce the answer. So it makes it feel a little bit more like it knows you, I guess, when it's giving you back the answers using these memories.
It's pretty cool that you can go in and see them. So I will go and do that. I'm not going to do that live in case it's something I don't wish to reveal. I'll go and do it after the episode.
Yeah, be careful with it. There's definitely some personal stuff in there that I wasn't going to read out on here, Hannah.
Yeah, Hannah, you are a hypochondriac. Okay. Hugh, from the research that I did ahead of the show, it doesn't sound like either of us is dissimilar to the norm. So most people are using ChatGPT for the same sort of everyday information queries and not necessarily using it for automation of tasks or coding, which is the use case you hear a lot about, but I'm like asking it what running shoes to buy, and so are other people.
Yeah, that's it. There was a paper that came out of OpenAI, I think around September last year, sort of a white paper. So not a peer-reviewed piece of research, but a white paper that came out. And first thing is that almost 80% of conversations fall into three buckets: practical guidance, seeking information, and writing. And so I think you and I, lots of practical guidance, lots of seeking information, but we probably didn't have in our top three writing, so whether it's refining things, creating emails, improving documents. And they also, interestingly, proposed a new framework for thinking about how these tools are used. And it's the asking, doing, expressing framework that they came up with. And what they figured out was that 49% were asking a question and getting back an answer. 40% of the prompts were getting it to do something. And then 11%, and this is super interesting, I know you'll love this, 11% is people just expressing something. So that's neither asking a question nor asking it to do something, it's just sharing a feeling with ChatGPT.
Okay, so to put that into real terms, let's take a cooking use case. Asking is like a simple question. So it might be like, is there cheese in pesto?
Yep.
Right?
100%.
And then doing would be like, create me a dairy-free pesto recipe.
Yep.
And then expressing would be,
I love the pesto.
Yeah, and that's it. I mean, I think the expressing is the thing I'm doing the least. It's kind of hard for me to get my head around. But you said 11% of interactions are that expressing thing.
Yeah, exactly. People just saying something to their LLM that's neither asking a question or asking it to do something. So, hey, I love the pesto. I love my running shoes.
Yeah. I guess maybe pesto and running shoes aren't the best for expression, whereas expression might be like, I'm really stressed and overwhelmed. And sometimes people just say that to their LLM in lieu of saying it to anyone else.
And I think this is pretty unique. Like, I think this is not something that we're all doing with Google. It's not something we're used to doing with our computer. So I think this is kind of new.
And listeners, just to give you a bit of a behind the curtain look into the podcast and Hugh's and My's relationship is I'm very fast and loose with how I think about my data. And so Hugh and I had like a big debate the other day of, what's the big deal with these LLMs? Like, I'm giving all my data away. If there's one thing I took from episode 1 of this season, it's I'm giving my data to everyone anyway. And this expressing point is the one where you sort of won me round in our debate, because that isn't anything that's replicated in Google or in WhatsApp or in your metadata from Google Maps. Is this whole like emotional piece, which is, I don't know if it was expected with these LLMs, but like it's certainly taken me by surprise.
In the OpenAI paper, they dug even deeper, Hannah, and they figured out that about 1.9%, so just under 2% of all prompts are sort of relationships, personal reflection kinds of commentary that people are having, and about 0.5% is role play and companionship. So people kind of, I guess, trying to have a relationship with their LLM.
Okay, well, I have a separate stat that there are 2.5 billion prompts a day to ChatGPT alone of a user set of between 2 and 300 million users. So what did you say? Like 1.5% sounds fairly low, but in absolute terms, that is a lot of people, or maybe a smaller number of people using it a lot for this relational, emotional support function, that is bizarre.
With those numbers too, actually, in this September paper from OpenAI last year, the latest number they had was 700 million users per week, which maybe is 300 million a day, maybe isn't too far apart. And that graph is going up to the right and almost vertical. So I think we could probably safely assume now that there's certainly more than 1 billion users a week using these tools, and probably that 2.5 billion is probably more like 3.5, 4 billion today. And heaven knows what it will be by the end of this season.
Okay, wow. So quick follow-up on this whole expressing use case. You've got 2 daughters who are in their early 20s, so like firmly in the younger generation, very tech savvy. Do you think that they use it, not necessarily to say they're using it for the expressing use case, but do you think that they're using it differently to how you would use it or I would use it? Because actually between me, you, and your daughters, we span 3 different generations, right?
Well, first of all, here's the big stat. Almost half of the messages to ChatGPT, half of the prompts come from people who are under 26. So that's the biggest difference.
Half of those prompts are coming from people under the age of 26. Wow.
Yep, which just shows you that there's very, very heavy student usage, for example. So lots and lots of people using it for homework, explanations, writing, social media posts, messages, emails, if they're still sending any. It's open all over their screens, whether it's the smartphone or not. And it's the co-pilot through life. Because the other really interesting stat that came out of this paper is that 73% of the usage of ChatGPT is non-work. So I think the myth out there is that it's a work tool, it's a productivity tool, but the reality is in fact that it's almost 3/4 non-work.
That is interesting because the whole rhetoric around the power and the disruption of AI is about how it's changing the way that we work. And whilst it certainly is, and I think I mentioned in a previous episode, like my husband's work have now implemented an AI policy where if you don't use AI every week, they call you up on it. So there's some of that. That feels a bit contrived though, whereas actually people are reaching for it to solve everyday problems that aren't work related. I think that certainly fits my pattern of use. I'm definitely using it more for recipes, workouts, general info. I'm using it to explain things to me more than I'm using it to summarize documents. I actually think in that when I asked for the summary, the one that I mentioned up front in the episode, it actually specifically called out, you're not using this for automation or summarizing, you're using it like more conversationally.
And I guess, look, if half the prompts are coming from people under 26, then I guess it's not all that surprising that it's more non-work use than work use, given disproportionately likely that population is still studying, doesn't yet have its first full-time job, and so on. So I think those things are correlated, but, it's a personal productivity tool used by young people.
Okay, so follow-up question. If it is much more personal queries and in some cases like emotional expression, is it worrying that we're pumping all of this personal information into the large language models, which presumably they're collecting and using for various different things? Like, is that a concern? Because I care less, if I'm honest, about what company documents I'm putting in. By the way, I am putting it into the enterprise ChatGPT, so it's licensed with all the right things, but that's less of a concern to me than some of the more personal stuff that I might be churning through with ChatGPT.
Yeah, and maybe let's just talk about that a little bit. What happens when you actually do type into ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, whatever it is. So first thing is, you're in the UK right now, I'm in Australia. There's absolutely no guarantee that the data that you're typing in is actually stored in Australia or the UK respectively, right? So that's not guaranteed. Quite likely that it is, given, they're both big countries for these companies. But, it could just as easily be stored in continental Europe in your case, or it could be stored on the west coast of the US in my case. So the data is potentially leaving the country and being stored somewhere else, and you have no control over that.
Okay, so on that basis, Hugh, thinking about data collection and storage, what data policies or data protection laws is my data in the UK subject to? Is that based on where the data is being stored, or is that based on where it's being collected?
Yeah, both. Both, Hannah. So let's imagine, we'll make up a fictional case, right? So let's imagine that your data that you're typing in is stored in the EU somewhere. And obviously the UK is famously not part of the EU anymore. So first of all, the company is offering the service in the UK to you, and so they have to comply with UK laws. So there's going to be some privacy laws in the UK, and because the company is operating their service in the UK, they have to make their best effort to comply with UK privacy laws, whatever they are. Right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is, because the data is fictionally stored in the EU, they also have to comply with the storage rules around data that's stored in the EU. So whatever the privacy limitations are, the anonymization limitations are, the retention limitations are, they have to be applied to your data because it's stored in the EU. And it could be subpoenaed in the EU. So if somebody wants to access your data, they could force the company to extract it from their EU data center and give it to them, even though you never knew that your data was stored in the EU. So two things are applying at once.
It's worth then knowing what different products are coming out of which countries, right? Like, I know this came up when DeepSeek, that AI model that came out of China, that must have been sort of the beginning of last year. And we got some warnings at work about what to use it for from like an IP perspective. But presumably countries like China, look, we know they have a different approach to data. And so if you're using a model that comes out of China or is somehow related to China, then it will be subject to a different approach on data protection.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And obviously, different countries all over the world have different approaches to these things. And some might feel familiar. So if you're in the UK, the EU privacy laws will feel pretty familiar. And some might feel a lot less familiar. So let's continue our fictional example here. So let's imagine that you're in the UK, you type a prompt, your data's stored in the EU, but behind the scenes, the folks at OpenAI want to inspect some prompts, and by chance they inspect your prompt and they evaluate it. It could be evaluated in Poland, it could be evaluated in Brazil, it could be evaluated in the UAE. It just depends on where they've hired that contingent workforce to evaluate the prompts and provide them with feedbacks on prompts. So your data could simultaneously be subject to the laws and rules of 3 different places, or potentially even more.
Well, I was going to say, if I'm in the US or a different country outside of the EU for work, or let's say when I was in Australia with you, I'm a UK user, which it must know. It's processing my data, I guess, based on where I'm launching the query, and then could be pitched all around the world for the human in the loop validation if it gets called out for that. And as we've talked about in previous episodes, that'll be often like a low-cost workforce that could be out of any of the countries that you just mentioned. So there's a lot of complexity in how it's being managed. And the reality is we don't know. And they can do all that and it's lawful, because as long as they're not breaking any laws, they can, I'm handing my data and it's up to them to use it within reason how they need to or see fit.
Yeah, absolutely. And even with their best efforts, it can be very complex for them to manage these data sets across the world. And that's why their legal folks get paid an enormous amount of money, and why they need very, very smart people working in their companies, because this is very, very complex. And the technology actually makes it even more complex, Hannah. So, back in the old days when I was working at Microsoft, we used to store 3 copies of everything. And the reason we did that is because we were storing data on very cheap computers that are very, very unreliable. And so you want to have 3 copies of all of the data. You want to put those in smart places just in case you lose one of the copies, because the computers are unreliable. And then if you lose one of the copies, you furiously make another copy so that you've got 3 again. And that gives you what's called 11 nines of reliability. So you have 99.99999 up to 9 nines after the decimal point of reliability. So you have almost no chance of losing any data ever if you have 3 copies. Folks like OpenAI and Anthropic today are well aware of that. And so they are also making sure that they have multiple copies of the data, and they're pretty smart about where they store them. They're more sophisticated than we were back in the day. So we used to just make sure that we had them in different parts of the data center, maybe across 2 data centers. They're really, really smart about different geographies, different data centers. And so there's even more complexity. So my hunch is they don't just have 3 copies of most of the data. They probably have 4, 5, or 6 copies. And those copies are deliberately going to be in very different places in case they lose a whole data center or maybe even lose a whole region of data centers. So your data is everywhere, Hannah.
And when you think about the complexity of the different scenarios they need to be preparing for, as you say, like it's really complex because we're such a global world these days. You're downloading an app or you're primarily using an app in one location, your home location. The app's from a different location, and then you're traveling around and you're subject to sort of all those jurisdictions and their specific requirements of companies that collect data. So it sounds like an enormous headache, to be honest with you.
Yeah, enormous headache. And, you got to remember these companies are sort of startup growth kinds of companies. So they're going to be doing their best, but it's also going to be quite chaotic inside these companies. And so they're definitely going to be moving fast and breaking things, as they say. And, there's going to be a lot of tension with the legal teams and a lot of tensions about where they launch and what they do. So it's going to be a very, very complex world when it comes to trying to make sure that they're complying with all of the laws and making sure that the data is stored where they think it is and, so on and so forth. But definitely, once you type your data in and you press that enter key, you're setting your data free, likely into many different jurisdictions, many different data centers and right across the world. And, you've kind of lost control of that.
One last point on data before I move us along, and I don't think there's a definitive answer to it, it's just an observation of mine, is that with things like LLMs, no one has more resource or better infrastructure to progress than these companies, right? They're commercial companies, they're getting tons of investment at the minute. On the flip side, like government agencies, in particular the legal departments of government agencies, are not known for their efficiency. They're very thorough, they might not be super well resourced. And there's a weird sort of disparity there because I just cannot see a world in which it all keeps up to the pace of the tech companies. And I don't know whether that's a problem or not, but there's definitely a contrast there.
I think it's super problematic, Hannah. With all due respect to smart lawyers who work in governments, these are not AI professionals, right? They don't understand the technology in depth. They may not even be listeners to this podcast.
Well, but also that the most expert people are the ones working in the companies, right? So even when it comes to, maybe we'll get into it in more detail later, but the recent like Pentagon versus Anthropic, when there was debate around the use case of LLMs in autonomous weapons and the government wanted the final say on whether or not the LLMs were safe to use. No one knows the LLMs better than the people who built and work with the LLMs, but they're all in the companies running the LLMs. They're not in all of the sort of adjacent medical boards and government agencies. So there's a pace disparity there that's problematic.
And look, it brings me to one thing that I really dislike about Australia. I've spent the last 9 years, I think now, back in Australia after my long stint in the US. And one of the things that infuriates me most about Australia is that we try and legislate what these companies can and can't do and stop them innovating. I much prefer the US climate where the companies are a little bit more freer to do the things that they want to do. And then if they do things that seem outside the bounds of reasonable, then people sue people. And so, somebody will sue somebody else and that will send a legal precedent that says that's where the boundary is. And so it's a lot more free and loose in the US and it's more of a reaction to what happens. Whereas I feel like in Australia, we'll have the Australian AI policy bill and we'll debate this thing and release it and we'll constrain all innovation before the innovation's even happened. And it's incredibly infuriating, Hannah.
It's an interesting debate. And one other facet of it that I think about quite a lot is that this AI revolution is taking place under a Trump administration in the US. And I'm wondering, what the heck kind of bearing is that going to have on where we land in the future on all this stuff? Because it's certainly the most unique administration of my lifetime. Yet we're having this huge societal and technological shift in the way we live our lives. And the US is normally like a real player in shaping how these things unfold. And it's just quite a unique world we find ourselves in on that front.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, it's a fairly pro-tech administration, I guess, is one thing that you might observe from a distance. So it certainly will be interesting to see how it plays out.
Okay, so let's get back to the sort of nuts and bolts of things. So we're putting all this data in, it's being processed under some sort of government jurisdiction, a bit of complexity there. But the actual ways that the data are being used. So if I call back to our episode around are our phones listening to us and we got talking about metadata and how companies process data, it's obviously super valuable for commercial purposes. But it's generally processed at an aggregate level, right? It's not likely that someone's going in and reading my exact prompts with ChatGPT unless it's a human in the loop type test. But I assume those are pretty low as a percentage of overall queries.
You got billions of these prompts per day, Hannah. So it's certainly not the case that any significant fraction of them are ever looked at by humans, but certainly some are. You've got this incredibly small probability that your prompt is actually looked at by a human. And the reason that somebody at OpenAI or at Anthropic or, at Google or Microsoft would look at this prompt is to improve the product, right? So they would open up your prompt and they'd make an assessment. Does it look like this user was happy with the response? Does it look like the LLM successfully answered the question? So just asking simple questions around the performance of the tool. And that's used in, all kinds of different ways that the companies are improving the products. But the chances of that happening is very, very small, and you can actually control it. So if you do go into ChatGPT and you go into your settings and you go down to data controls, if you do go into data controls, you'll find there's a little slider for an option that's called improve the model for everyone. And it's turned on by default. And what that means is basically two things, Hannah. So the first thing is that your content can be used to train future models. And also it means that humans can inspect your data for this quality improvement process. So if you kind of want to opt out of that, you can just turn that toggle off, and then your data won't be used in any future training and it won't be looked at by individual humans.
Do you think that will always be an option? Like, I see some websites, if you want anything other than the standard cookies, which is a similar sort of like personal data point, you have to use the paid for version if you want to turn that stuff off. Do you think that's where this will eventually head, which is like, if you want the privilege of us not using the data for training, you're going to have to pay a subscription?
No, I don't think so. I think what happens with these advanced options, right? And remember, I'm well down in the settings here, right? For most of our curious listeners, this is going to be new news, right? That you can actually go into settings, data controls, and turn off improve the model for everyone. Most of our listeners are going to go, oh, that's cool. I might go do that. With these advanced options, nobody ever turns them off, right? So you would find that probably 0.1%, 0.2% of users today have actually turned this off. And even with us releasing a podcast that explains how people should do it, it's really not going to change how people access these advanced options. So I just don't think it's an issue for them. As long as the toggle is turned on by default, they're going to be happy campers because nobody will actually go into an advanced option and turn it off.
And there's also other things that you can toggle. It's less data related, but my husband was telling me that you can change the level of enthusiasm and the tone, or level of cynicism. So he recently turned his to be meaner because there's this whole maybe we should talk about this for a second. There's this whole phenomenon that LLMs can be quite affirmative in their nature, which I presume gets people to use them more because it's nice when someone agrees with you. But I did read that there's it can be a bit problematic with conspiracy theorists who just get validation on their view that the world is flat from ChatGPT that's hey, that's a great point, and there's plenty of reason to believe it's true. So he made his a bit more cynical, but you can make it less chatty, you can make it a bit more positive.
Yeah, you can. And I think this is a reaction by the folks at OpenAI to Claude, if you like, because Claude has always been a little bit more your friend, a little bit more chatty. And so I think the ChatGPT folks have made it possible now to control the sort of style and tone of ChatGPT to allow people to make it be a little bit more Claude-like, or perhaps pick a different personality. But if our listeners want to follow along, you can go into ChatGPT, into the settings and into personalization, and you'll see an option called base style and tone. And you can indeed pick different kinds of personalities. I've got mine set to candid because I just wanted to get to the point. But you can choose professional, friendly, candid, quirky, efficient, nerdy, and my favorite, cynical.
Cynical. That sounds very British. I think the quirky would be annoying. I might play around with it because, now that you've directed me to that in the app, there's base style and tone, and then there's these characteristics, including how much it uses emojis, and then whether it's warm, enthusiastic. Interesting.
Yep. So you can make yours less enthusiastic, less of a cheerleader, Hannah. I think when it comes back to conspiracy theories, Hannah, we talked about this a lot back in episode 7 of season 1. We have to just remember that these are probabilistic, monkeys, if you like. And so ChatGPT, it's got this huge context window of all these different words and tokens, and then it's generating plausible output that follows those, right? So if you're having a long conversation about a conspiracy theory about the earth being flat or whatever it is, it's going to generate sentences that follow on nicely from the context of what you've been talking about. So, of course, surprise, surprise, it will agree with you and reinforce the kinds of conversation that's having. I mean, that's just how this technology works.
So it's creating even more echo chambers for folks.
Yeah, it's producing plausible output given the context that it has. That's all these LLMs do.
Yeah, and it's dressed up so cleverly to feel like you're having a conversation with someone to whom you want to divulge. It sounds like deep personal information. But yeah, you're right. This is literally just a probabilistic model giving you the most likely satisfactory response as a result of the prompt going in, and that is it.
Yeah, and it's incredibly impressive because it's trained on trillions of words. It cost a blockbuster movie to train. It is an impressive probabilistic machine. And so the context that it produces is incredibly relevant to the conversations that you're having or the task that you're doing. But it is a probabilistic text generator. And we're going to have a really good interview coming up later in the season, Hannah, about the future of AI. And I'm going to get into it with our guest, who I won't do a spoiler yet, but we're going to get into it with our guest and talk about the future of AI. And, is it possible that these machines will ever become intelligent? But they're certainly not intelligent today.
Yeah, they're just dressed up to feel really intelligent, which is that is the secret sauce, right? Suddenly AI has come to the fore, and that's the reason, because it feels like we're talking to someone. And I guess that harps back to the point we made, which is most people are reaching to this for majority non-work use cases because it's like a pocket digital life coach, I think I saw it described as. And I think that's probably pretty fair. Like all the things we discussed, whether it's, workout advice or recipes or something more interesting than that, it's all under that umbrella of life coach, career, sometimes relationship advice.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Can we talk a little bit more about training? I've actually just opted out of training while we've been talking. Is that something we should be worried about, or inverse? Is that something we should be open to? Because I think it says in the app, do you want to improve it for everyone? And you're like, oh, well, I do kind of want to improve it for everyone. But what does that mean in practice?
Yeah, so what that means in practice is that in future training runs, if you've opted in, your data can be used in the training process. But I think what our listeners have to remember is it's aggregated with billions of other prompts typed in per day. And so you are, a drop in an ocean isn't even fair, right? You are less than a drop inside an ocean. And so very literally, what will happen is that you'll influence in a very minute way the style and the probability of a word appearing in a future model. Your text is never going to be verbatim reproduced by the model in a future model. So you might say, well, I really want to protect my privacy. I don't want them to use it in training, and you might choose to turn that off. But I think by leaving it on, all you're doing is becoming part of the masses that influences the probability of a word being generated and perhaps, the probability of a certain tone of phrase coming out of the LLM. So I think in practice, it probably doesn't really matter.
That's a bold statement, but we're going to make it on this podcast. It doesn't really matter on an individual level.
No, I don't think so. But I would say, because humans can inspect your data and because you're putting your data in an unknown jurisdiction and because your data is moving around the world, you probably should be a little thoughtful about what data you upload to these systems. So personally, I would not upload my medical records and just have them stored randomly in some country, randomly copied around the world. And I'm not sure that I'd want any probability of a human opening up and having a look at a PDF of my personal medical records. So I think we should all be thinking about what data we're sharing. And I think if we're not comfortable with that, then just don't upload the data.
Yeah, so common sense use. It's probably never going to get looked at. There's a small probability that it will. Don't share anything too overtly personal because you just shouldn't do that anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. So just using common sense. But in practice, your personal details aren't going to appear out of a model in the future for somebody else. You just don't have that influence in the training process.
Fair enough. I do think people will get a kick, though, out of now that you've tipped everyone off how to look at their memories. It'll be like their Spotify Wrapped. They'll go into their ChatGPT and see what it makes of them.
So maybe homework for you, Hannah, is before our season wrap episode, a bit more expressing. And you can report back. We'll chat about how our LLM use changed based on our observations of LLM use. What do you think?
Yep, that's totally fair. And this whole expressing point, I wonder if I should be using ChatGPT more as a coach. I don't know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's certainly an interesting thing that's a use case that's bubbling up in sort of over 10% of prompts, but not one I've explored in depth just yet. Okay, guys, this has been the Tech Overflow podcast. If you've liked what you've heard, please Like, subscribe, leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and share with your friends, family, anyone who you think might be curious about how tech works.
Yeah, and if you'd like to learn more about the show, you can follow us on our socials. We are on LinkedIn, X, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube Shorts. And of course, we've got our own website, techoverflowpodcast.com. So we'll see you next time, Hannah.
Take care, guys.
Take care. Bye.